those who just quite candidly either don't believe that a God exists or believe that God could exist. And a couple of questions that I think are very common that we oftentimes encounter, and we need to be able to at least have an idea of how we could explain from our perspective as Christians, disciples of Jesus Christ, not cultural Christianity, of how to answer some of these. And one question is that I would think would be very common is, what proof do you have that God exists? Many atheists frequently ask, that why is it that God would desire worship, and why would he have it in such a way that his existence would be not undeniably clear? And you think about that, that is one of those things that involves faith, and it involves us believing in things that we can't physically see. And I find it interesting because of the fact that many Christians, whether they're cultural Christians or whether they're true disciples of Jesus Christ, and they will oftentimes reference the fact that their worship is evidence that God exists. And according to a recent Pew Research Center poll, belief in God varies widely across all kinds of cultures and demographics, even within cultural Christianity, which I think adds to the confusion and or argument that many atheists view. And when they look at Christianity, or for that matter, any religion that identifies a God or a higher superior being, and they look at that and they said, well, if God exists, then it wouldn't be so confusing from a worship perspective, and it would be universal. Oftentimes, too, another question is, why doesn't God communicate directly today as he allegedly did in the past? Of course, when we look at the Bible, we are viewing the perspective of what is in the written word, and we see in that written word many times stories where God is directly interacting with people on earth. Think about Noah. Think about, as just one example, but think about that from the perspective of, it was, air quotes, doomsday being predicted based on the way that people were living, and God chose to communicate directly with Noah. And many atheists will point out to you today, well, a lot of Christians talk about how doomsday is about to happen again, and as a result of that, why isn't God communicating directly to a person like he did with Noah? And we oftentimes can invite that question because of the fact that we speak of prophetic events that are occurring in the future. So I think that when we consider these two common questions, proof that God exists and communication with God, I think those are two things that we need to first get an appropriate handle on ourselves with our relationship before we begin to try to educate, enlighten, and or articulate anything to anyone else. Because if you don't have a clear understanding in yourself, your message will be easily shot down when you have a discussion with somebody. There's an interesting concept that I think is in John chapter 14, and I'd like for us to begin in John chapter 14, because here we have a disciple of Jesus Christ, Philip, making, at the very end of Jesus Christ's ministry here on earth, as first appearance as a human being, a somewhat startling comment. In John chapter 14, we'll begin in verse 8. Philip said to him, speaking to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Some translations say, and we will be satisfied. So Philip is asking Jesus, after experiencing a close relationship in the form of a disciple, let's just say 3 potential years, maybe 3 and 3 years and 5 months, because this is right near the end when Jesus Christ is about to be crucified. And here you have someone asking this question. You think about it and you think, well, wait a minute, man, you've been around him for 3 years, give or take a few more months, and you still are going to ask that question of someone that you've identified as the Son of God? That's a perplexing question to ask. Perhaps when we look at this example, Philip was asking for, again, a direct communication, evidence or proof visually of the Father. Perhaps. We don't know exactly. When we think about this, there are some recorded events for which even in the Old Testament, predating Philip in this case, we see that Jesus, who was the God of the Old Testament, in a glorified state, had interactions with men on earth. Interactions with Jacob face to face. He wrestled with him. Interactions with Moses. We'll come to that in a second message, where he saw him and even in a veiled view, he saw him and his face was so, we'll just use the term, sunburnt and reflecting so much radiation back to him, Moses had to have a veil for everyone else to even communicate with him and see him. Joshua had an interaction with him as they were going over the Jordan River and about to go into the Promised Land. Elijah had an event with him, Isaiah and Ezekiel as well. Perhaps that's what was in Philip's mind. Perhaps. We don't know exactly. But regardless of what Philip's expectations were, we see here that there was a sincerity in Philip's question that Jesus acknowledged and did not ridicule. We can sit back today and criticize the disciples of Jesus Christ for a lot of the things that they said and did. But in the moment, Jesus, who could read their hearts and minds, did not seem to be quite as frustrated with them as you and I may be today, and as I've heard people say today. Jesus was able to see that they had sincerity in their hearts and minds. Continuing on into verse 9, notice Jesus' response. Have I been so long with you that you have not come to know me, Philip? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Verse 10, do you not believe that I am in the Father and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak of my own initiative, but the Father abides in me and does his works. So we see here, again, a sincerity in Jesus' answer, and he may have been somewhat disappointed, but he did not ridicule him. He did not come across in a very stern manner, a difficult manner, or a put-off manner. He answered him with an answer that referenced, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father, because we abide one another. And it is interesting when you look at this, that this showing the Father is, there's a genuineness to Philip's question and a response to that genuine factor that I think perhaps is very easily recognizable when we look at the example of Job. You might want to hold your place here in John chapter 14, but let's turn over to Job chapter 42. I think most of us are somewhat familiar with the story of Job, and while many have in recent years looked at that and made reference to the fact that that story is somewhat allegorical, that, there's no physical evidence that this person actually existed, that there is something here that I think that while we believe that it was a real person and a real interaction, we know that Job had an interaction very unique to Jesus Christ, the God of the Old Testament, according to the Apostle Paul, And we also see that he had a lot of direct impacts and a lot of direct events happen in his life directly from Satan himself being directed to harm him. But after all of the things that Job went through, notice verse 5 in chapter 42. This is Job speaking to the Lord. As we see in verse 1, he says, I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. There is a difference between hearing and seeing and knowing. There is a difference between professing that you are a Christian and having a direct relationship with the Father through Jesus Christ. There is hearing of and knowing of a story, but there is a difference in being a participant in the story, in the event. There is a huge difference in seeing not just the physical, but experiencing the mental aspects of this relationship and closeness. You know, he makes this comment, now I have seen with my eyes. Basically, he's saying, in paraphrase, that you are the living God. I perceive now the reality of your presence. It's not some seminary theological discussion that I've entered into with a debate with somebody. It's not head knowledge and refuting scriptures back and forth and going back and forth. It is something real that now I can only experience and know on a deep level that transcends any kind of theological discussion. It is real, and there is a reality that I now perceive that I did not perceive when I was keeping all of your laws, commandments, statutes, judgments, all the things that Job did prior to this. Think about that. You know, yes, we are to do the things that are outlined in Scripture for us to do. They are to teach us, and they are to lead us to a close relationship. And even though Job had done all of those things, and God had blessed him before them, because God even told Satan, my servant, behold my servant Job. There's none like him in all the things that he's done. But even in all those things he did, he still did not see God. And reality did not hit home. And I think that is important for each one of us to always understand, because it's almost as if that is the crux of the question that Philip was asking the individual that had this conversation with Job in a different state and form that he was having with this other disciple of his that he had spent a tremendous amount of close activity for 3 years and perhaps a few months. Same question. Same ultimate question in reality. The Apostle Paul has a very similar comment in 2 Timothy. Turn over to 2 Timothy. We think of all of the things that he went through, the things that he did, and whether we want to say that he was a, air quotes, tough nut that had to go through a lot to be cracked, perhaps he was, perhaps you are, perhaps I am. And perhaps that's some of the reasons why we go through what we go through. But after all of the things that the Apostle Paul experienced here in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, he says, for this reason I also suffer these things, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him until that day. That is a close relationship. And it is, that very phrase, I know whom I have believed, who I have put my trust in. When we reach that kind of relationship that we know, and as a result of that, it is a far different relationship than this high-level, superficial, theological viewpoint. But it is personal and it is deep within. Those are the things that I think allow the ability for us to have proof that God exists on a personal level, as well as communication on a personal level. If all we are talking and spouting either another person's viewpoint and or what some commentary says about something, while it may have the ability to help us and develop a more rich relationship, if we don't have that relationship to begin with, then there won't be the ability, and I'll come to that in a minute, the ability for us to grow closer. Let's turn back to John 14. John 14. The answers to the abilities to articulate appropriately, correctly, efficiently, effectively must be resolved internally first before we can ever be successful externally with the message going forward. Going back to John 14, we read verses 8 and 9 and 10, but then skipping down to verse 18. Jesus, again, knew that he was about to be leaving this physical life, and he says, I will not leave you as orphans. I will come to you. After a little while, the world will no longer see me, but you will see me because I live. You will live also. And I don't know to what level of perception these disciples of Jesus Christ had at that moment. Obviously, we say it today, and it's true in our own lives. Hindsight's 20/20. Oh yeah, after we look back, all these things make a lot of sense. But in the moment, do they all make sense? We would be, I think, somewhat disingenuous to think that our lives, every one of us and everyone outside, that we understand and have a total grip on our lives. Now, we live in a world for which many people have no grip on their lives. We feel as if we can, at least through God's help, navigate in the right direction, but at no point do I think we ever, until we look back on time, experience things and say, you know, I didn't understand what I was going through then, but man, am I glad. It wasn't happy in the moment. It wasn't anything I want to ever do again, but man, I'm glad that happened to me. I can think of that in many parts of my life, and I'm sure you can too. Continuing on into verse 20, he says, and after a little while, in 20, in that day rather, you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I am in you. So here's the thing that I pose as a question. For Jesus to make that comment in verse 20, after Philip initiated this in verse 8, was it perhaps that they would not, even as disciples, truly understand and see until after Jesus Christ had left, and they would have the hindsight to understand what they were experiencing for that 3, let's just say, and a half years? Just a question. Perhaps. I mean, I'm not saying definitively because I don't know. But I would submit to you and submit to myself that before we become too critical of the disciples and their events and their things, that perhaps we would have the same type of overall viewpoint and compassion, so to speak, that Jesus appeared to have, because he never really derided them, ridiculed them to the level that I have even heard many people in messages say towards them about how could they be so blind and how could they be so dumb. Perhaps this was by design, based on what we see here in verse 20. It wasn't until after that they would then be able to connect the dots of the Father, of Jesus Christ, and them, and that relationship between all three parts that had to be in place for the unity to be total, for the unity to be complete and understood. And perhaps, you think, well, when do we have that kind of unity? I think when we think about 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and we consider what occurs at baptism, That is what we are looking towards, what Jesus Christ referenced in verse 20 of chapter 14 in John is what we see in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 17. But the one who joins himself to the Lord is one spirit with him. And of course, the joining of the spirits, and we're not talking anything that's mysterious here. We're talking about relationship. We're talking about minds. We're talking about hearts, intents. We're talking about motivations. We're talking about will. My will, God's will. Your will, God's will. Personal will, God's will. When we unite, that's what we say we're doing when we go through the baptism process, so that we can unite with the Spirit and unite with them in spirit, I should say, and develop that oneness, that unity. But here's the thing. If you're honest with yourself, if I'm honest with myself, when I first got baptized, I don't feel that I had that close relationship. Not at first. It required a step in that direction, but then as you continue in that direction, then you develop the closeness over time. Long time to reach that point. It's not an instant gratification like we live in the society around us today. I get quite frustrated now if I'm touching my phone and it's not immediately pulling something up. You know, if I'm on my computer and there's a slowness in the processing, I get quite angry about that now. We need to understand that it takes time for all of these things to develop, but that's the direction and course. Now, going back to John chapter 14, let's now drop down to verse 21. A very important thing here is stated. Again, just for context, verse 20, in that day you will know that I am in the Father, and you in me, and I will be in you. He who has my commandments and keeps them is the one who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and will disclose myself to him. Some translations use the word manifest myself to him. So you see that knowing that a God exists, knowing that Jesus Christ is an individual, all of the theological things taught in seminaries today, whether they are, individuals that are very sincere or not, doesn't really matter. All of that is superficial to the level of what we're speaking of here. The level of manifestation, disclosure, unveiling, revealing, understanding. I see you with my eyes, or I hear you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. There's a difference there. It's not about head knowledge. It's even that matter if you really want to get down to it. While the Sabbath, the holy days, and all the other things are things that keep us in a direction to this, ultimately, if we do these things, then the manifestation occurs. It doesn't occur until we do all these things. We can go through the process of baptism, and I don't care how many times you get baptized. You can go through the process. But until we open up and we develop this kind of mindset that he's speaking of here, it will only be then that manifestation and disclosure occurs. We think about it. In verse 22, I think is a very interesting comment. Judas, not Iscariot, said to him, Lord, what then has happened that you are going to disclose? Yourself to us and not to the world? And Jesus answered and said to him, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our abode with him, our house with him. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at that parable about a house and spirits, and how even if you have a bad spirit in your life and you get on the path of repentance and you turn and it's removed, if you don't then put within your house, your mind, the ways of turning away from the evil it can come back 8 times, because 8 different spirits would come back. But if you choose to keep the word, you choose to keep the commandments, and you choose to change your life, then who's going to come? Not the 8 evil spirits spoken of in that parable we read a couple of weeks ago, but the Father and Jesus Christ himself. And when they come in, that's when Jesus manifests and reveals himself. It's not about this as much as it is about what's in our hearts and minds relative to our head, and not just the articulations that come out of our mouth. You know, I think what we see here is that faith precedes the experience with Christ. An atheist who says, show me a proof that God exists, show me the fact that God is communicating directly with someone like he did with Noah. If you believe that, because you believe the world's about to come to an end again, then why is he having a conversation with somebody right now? This is how I think we can begin to properly understand that we have to develop the faith first to precede the experience of Christ's manifestation, then be able to say that based on our experiences, we begin to see and experience the fact that there is a proof that he exists, because I don't just know him in a seminary theological manner, I know him in a very personal manner. As a result of that, we have the ability to have and enter into, on any time availability, pick up the telephone as the metaphor and speak directly to the Father himself through Jesus Christ. I won't ask you to turn, but you can write this in your notes, Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 9. Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9. It is by grace that you've been saved through faith. You know, when we think about it, Paul even goes into the church at Ephesus and references the fact that it's not by works in verse 9. It's by faith that we are saved. And it is because of the grace being given to us that development of faith can occur, but it requires faith first, then the substantiation of the faith by the manifestation of Christ. There is an order. The Apostle Paul talks about, in church services, there needs to be decency and order, not chaos. In our relationship, there has to be decency and order. We have to live decent lives. The Apostle Paul refers to it as a circumspect life in a world around you of chaos. So that's the order, the decency rather. But then there is an order to our life. An order of God's will first, our will second. An order of putting forth the things that he says, his word, his commandments, living them, doing them. That puts order to our life. And even though we may not have 100% total, grasp of every single thing in our life, we do know that it will lead us in the right way, and we won't have the 8 evil spirits coming back to abide with us. Again, I won't ask you to turn here, but you can write this scripture down, Luke 16, verse 31. Luke 16, verse 31. Christ makes the comment that he says that even if they were to resurrect Moses and the prophets, that would not convince them. Even if you resurrected someone from the dead. So the sign that was being sought out by the religious establishment, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because the heart was hardened. While we're here, let's continue on in verse 23 in chapter 14 of John. And Jesus answered and said, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come and make our abode with him. He who does not love me does not keep my words, and the words which you hear is not mine, but the Father who sent me. And I think that is the revelation and the manifestation of Christ and the Father is through Jesus Christ, and that is the only way for which we can have the true understanding. Now, let's skip just a couple of chapters over to chapter 16 in John, chapter 16. But I think there was something else that Jesus was going to give to the disciples and many others that was an evidence, a proof that he was who he said he was. In chapter 16, you know, what we read in chapter 14 is a lot of faith, a belief in things not seen. But Jesus is going to say, if you have the faith first, then the substantiation is going to come for the physical evidence. But you must believe first. Believe in things that you don't see quite yet. Chapter 16, verse 16, he says, a little while, and you will no longer see me. And again, a little while, and you will see me. And some of his disciples said to one another, what is this thing that he's telling us? A little while, and you will see me. And a little while again, you will see me. And because, he said, I go to the Father. So they were saying, what is this that he's saying? A little while. We do not know what he's talking about. Jesus knew that they wished to question him. He could perceive it, and he said to them, are you deliberating together about this, that I said a little while, and you will not see me, and again a little while you will see me? Truly I say to you, that you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice, and you will grieve, but your grief will be turned into joy. And of course we know, based on looking back now, hindsight 2020, the rest of the story, we know what Jesus was referring to. They didn't, not in the moment. But Jesus was able to then they were able to understand later that what Jesus was articulating in the moment was the fact that he was going to be crucified, he was going to die, he was going to be in the earth for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he would be resurrected, and they would see him again. Faith, belief first, and the substantiation of that. You know, you think about this. If that resurrection had not occurred, from the standpoint of them physically seeing him, do you think perhaps that over the course of time, some of their faith could wane? I mean, let's be honest. Let's be real. If you didn't see him come back, interact with you, all that he said would just be words, theological seminary talk. But because he came back and they saw him, there was a substantiation that probably led to a greater conviction, a greater depth of an understanding that they didn't have before. And that's how important the resurrection truly was. I thought about this as well. Let's just say, we use this term, a person is hedging their bets today. Let's just say, for an example, that Jesus articulated all this stuff that he said, and it's all on the paper. You know, they had the interaction, but it's all on the paper for us today. And let's just say that he was going to wait out his time till after all these people died before he was actually resurrected. What would have been the point? They had to see it to believe it and to have that conviction and depth of conviction. And I think that is why so much of why he said and articulated over and over. I mean, just in Matthew's account alone, there were 5 different occasions. You can write these down if you want. Matthew 16:21, Matthew 17:9, Matthew 17:22 through 23, Matthew 20:18 through 19, and Matthew 26:31 through 32. Every one of those instances, he makes the comment that he was going to be dead and he would be risen again, and they would see him after 3 days and 3 nights. The fact that he articulated that 5 times, I think, puts a tremendous amount of emphasis on that. He didn't just say it once. He said it 5 times. And I think that is why, my opinion, why it is so important to them that they had to see evidence of the faith for what they were about to encounter and what they were to go through in their life. You know, he even mentions the fact that, you know, he would be lifted up from the earth and would draw all men to himself. And of course, we see in Scripture, he says that he said this to show the way in which he would die. And of course, we know, looking back now, in the moment when he said that, they probably didn't grasp what he was talking about. But the fact that he was on a stake in the form of a criminal, and he was above the ground, and then he would die, and then be resurrected back, have interaction with them, and then draw them closer to him, and then they would be used as tools to draw many closer to him. That's how important I think this truly is, and how important it should be to us. And when we have these interactions, when we have these discussions about proof, we have these discussions about communication, whether it's with atheists or whether it's with others, we need to understand that it is a developmental process that takes time, not as quickly and as impatient as we are on our timetable. It's on his timetable. And the fact that others would question, scoff, and or come up with their own theories and ideas about to disprove all these things, the reality of it is that once we enter into it on a personal level, it becomes very personal. You know, here in our local community, we have these individuals that are personal attorneys. And one attorney's firm, their little tagline is, you know, it's personal to us. Well, I get that, but what I'm talking about here is the relationship issue is not a theological seminary discussion. It's not words. It has to be personal, like it was personal to the disciples. And we see evidence in our life and proof in our life when we ask for things and we see if we ask the right, we don't ask amiss, we ask the right, these things come true. That's evidence, that's proof that you're in that relationship. I think that's important so that we can all have Jesus Christ manifest himself for whatever lies ahead in the future for us.